That's how we would get the attention of our children when it was dinner time, and it was like really loud. Like, in the name of the Father, and everybody gets quiet, so it works. Thank you all for coming tonight. Tonight we're going to talk about an interesting story, and it's our own story. It's God's story, and it ultimately will redefine or define for you your whole worldview and your whole outlook on life. So we're going to start at the very beginning. You know why? Because it's a good place to start. So in the beginning, the world came into existence. And the question is, how did the world come into existence? And there's a lot of prevailing worldviews. Oh, by the way, the acoustics in here I know are really bad, so if you can't hear me or if I'm too loud, let me know, and I can adjust kind of how I do the microphone. So, all right. So the world comes into existence. Wait, what? Okay. So the world comes into existence, and how do we know that? Because we're here, and there's a world around us, and there's a world that we live in. And so, how did this world come to be? And the other question is, why did this world come to be? So, the fundamental question that we can ask is, why is there something rather than nothing? And if you listen to the news and the scientists of today, the prevailing wisdom is, it all happened by chance. There was some random explosion of things that happened one time, billions and billions of years ago, that eventually created everything that we see in this universe. Okay? That's one view. Let's take a step down that view. If everything happened by chance, then that means you're here by chance. It was by chance that humans evolved, and it was by chance that you came into existence. And if that's the case, you have no purpose here. You have no ultimate goal or end. You're a product of random circumstance and chance. So if that's your worldview, what is your life outlook? Hopelessness, fear, despair. And so how do you fight that? You seek pleasure and you avoid pain. Because if this world is all there is, then how do I be happy in this world? I seek pleasure, power, money, sex, whatever, and I avoid anything that's painful, because that would be bad. So let me give you another worldview. Another worldview is that we can look at creation and we can see by science and by study that there is order to this creation. Everything in creation obeys laws. There is a structure and a process to everything. No matter where you are, we'll talk about Earth for a minute, no matter where you are on this planet, if you let something go, it will fall to the ground. It's called the law of gravity. All bodies of matter in the entire universe operate that way. They're all drawn to one another in some way, shape, or form. The universe itself is also ordered. There's a structure and a process to it. And if you look at the world around us, because of the order and the law and the way that it operates, it points to an intelligence. It points to a design. How do we know this? We can know this just intellectually because anytime we see something of beauty or order, what do we automatically draw to ourselves? What does our mind automatically draw to? Who created that? Because we know fundamentally anything of order does not happen by chance. In fact, there's a whole scientific study of chaos theory that says that everything left to itself will fall into chaos, not order. So order, by definition, or by construct and theory, would indicate that there is a design. And if there's a design, then there's an intelligence behind it. So without going into all the fundamental proofs that there is an intelligent designer, let's just leave it at that and say this worldview takes another step and says, if there is a designer and an intelligence behind all of the creation, how did it come into being? Well, before anything existed, there was nothing. Even science will tell you that. Even people who don't believe in God will tell you that. Before there was something, there was nothing. How do you get something out of nothing? Well, one of the fundamental scientific laws is matter can never be created nor destroyed. Therefore, if there is nothing, you can never have something by nature. So something or someone had to create at one point out of nothing. And to create out of nothing requires a power that's beyond any human understanding or experience. Because in no human experience have we ever created out of nothing. So creating something out of nothing requires something or someone that is all-powerful. Because otherwise it can't happen. So we have an intelligent design creator, all-powerful. And this designer and creator created the entire world and the entire universe just with a thought. Required no work, no effort, just a thought. So this worldview goes like this. There is nothing. God says, let there be, and there is. So it's effortless for God to create. And as creation comes into being, God creates it with order. And so if we think about the way that this worldview is described to us in the Jewish scriptures, first of all, God creates an order, a form to the world. So the very beginning of the Bible, and we haven't talked about why we should believe the Bible, but I'm just using it as an example of being able to present this worldview. Okay? So in the beginning of the Bible, it says, in the beginning, it was the world, everything was formless and void. Nothing existed. So the first 3 days of creation, we hear about creation over 6 days, which is literature, and it's inspired poetry. It's not literal science, right? Genesis chapter 1 is not teaching science. It's talking about why God created. So the first 3 days of creation, God creates form. The second 3 days of creation, God fills the form. So it's no longer formless and void, the world. But now the world is created. So God has created all things, and at the end of creation, He creates human beings. You are the pinnacle of the entire universe. You are the entire reason the universe exists. That's why God created. so that you could exist and have the world. But that's not all. And we'll talk about the second part of it in a minute. So now let's look at that worldview for a second. The worldview that says there is a creator, a God, who created the universe and created you. Now, what kind of worldview does that give you? Now there's hope after this world. There's something beyond this world. So you have hope. It also means that you have something to live for. Because one of the reasons that we were created is we were created for a purpose. Every one of you were created for a purpose. And so what is that purpose? To know that purpose, we have to look at God when God created you. When God created humanity first, and then you came from that. So we hear in the creation story how God created all things. And just to give you a scope and a magnitude, when God created all things, there's a little throwaway phrase in Genesis chapter 1 where it says, God created the heavens and the earth, and he took the moon and the sun, the two great lights, he created them and hung them, one in the day and one for the night. And there's a little phrase at the end that says, and all the stars. Does anybody know how many stars there are in the universe? Just out of curiosity. Well, if you think about how many stars there are in the universe, first of all, in one galaxy, there is something in the order of 100 billion stars in one galaxy. There's about 100 billion galaxies in the universe. That gives you a perspective to what God did. Another perspective. Anybody ever heard of a light year? Probably. A lot of people think that light years are a measure of time, but they're not. It's a measure of distance. Because a light year is the amount of distance light travels in a year. The universe is 46 billion light years across, at least as we know it now, and it's ever expanding. Or we're ever discovering further and further boundaries of it. 46 billion light years across. So to give you a little bit of perspective, 1 light second is 186,000 miles. 1 light hour, 671 million miles. Just to give you a little bit of perspective. How big the universe is. So just the Milky Way that we live in, where our solar system is 100,000 light years across. 100,000 light years across. 1 light year is 5.8 trillion miles. So the universe is 5.8 trillion miles times 46 billion. Can't even do that math. All right, let's look at it a different way. If I were to ask you to count to a trillion, how long do you think that would take? A long time. If I took somebody over here and I said, okay, you guys, y'all count to 1,000,000. Like, let's say you counted once per second, right? 1,000,000 seconds, it would take you 12 days to get there. 12 days. If I asked you to count to 1,000,000,000 seconds, some of you would already be dead. 1,000,000,000 seconds takes 31 years. 31 31 years to get to 1 billion. We're not even at a trillion yet. 1 trillion seconds? 31,000 years. 31,000 years. And the universe is multiple quadrillions big. This is the God we're talking about. And I think a lot of times, the reason I point that out is because a lot of times when we think of God, I should say every time we think of God, we think way too small. The God we're talking about created all of that by thinking about it. That's how creation happened. That same God created you. And why? So when God finally gets around to creating humanity, on day 6, at the end of all of creation, he says, let us make man in our image. And in male and female he created them. So one of the things that God reveals to us about himself is that God is a plurality. Let us make man in our image. God is a plurality. You've probably heard the phrase, God is love. But you might have heard it in this very cool and sentimental way. But the reality is that God is love. Because God is a communion of persons. Eventually, we're going to talk more about the Trinity. But just suffice it to say for now that God is a multitude of persons. More than one. In this one nature, one divine nature, but multiple persons. Which is a communion of love. Why do I point that out? Because love, perfect love, is diffusive of itself, meaning it gives away. It doesn't hold on. Love gives away. So God is love, and God says, this God who is all-powerful, and oh, by the way, infinite, meaning there's nothing else bigger or beyond God. God has no gaps. There's nothing God needs. He's all-powerful. He's infinite. What does he need? So God doesn't create for himself. He doesn't need to create anything. He doesn't need us. So why does he create us? Because he wants us to be able to share in that love that he is. God wants us to be part of that love. The Bible tells us, and in another talk we'll talk about why we can believe what the Bible says, but for now, the Bible tells us that we were made to become part of God, to be sharers in the divine life, to be divinized. That's the reason we exist, is to become united to God. That is our purpose. That's why we're here. So this all-powerful God who created the entire universe with quadrillions and trillions of stars over so much space that we can't even imagine it, created you to be in relationship with him. That's why you're here. How do we know this? Because when he creates humanity, he says he creates male and female. But the way that worked was, he creates the man first. The man is created, and God creates this beautiful garden and puts all kinds of food and animals and trees and vegetation and everything else everything the man could want, fully taken care of. Imagine being in a situation where you have nothing that you need that is not provided. That's where Adam was. Adam was the first man that God created. That's what the situation he's in. But he's alone. And he comes to a realization of himself because God parades all of the creatures before him in the entire world. And he realizes that none of the animals on the earth can I be in relationship with. Doesn't work. So God puts him to sleep and creates woman. Out of the side of man, creates the woman. When the man and the woman see each other, the man exclaims, "At last, somebody that I can actually have a relationship with. Someone who is like me." And the two become one flesh. That's marriage. The man and the woman becoming one. And so that is how creation gets started. So why do I go through all of that? Because right now, your picture of God, you should be feeling awe and wonder of who this God is that looks at you, created you, and loves you. The other thing that God did when he formed Adam is he breathed his life into Adam. That's how humanity got life. God breathed his life into man. That's why we have life. And we are made of body, physical matter, and a spirit that God breathed into us, his life, the life of God. That body and spirit combination is who you are. You're not a spirit trapped in a body, you're not a body that's trying to get rid of the spirit. You're body and spirit together. That's you as a person. So, that's how God created you. What that also shows to the man and the woman is God gives them everything that they need in the garden when he puts them there. And God created all this, and he looked at it and said, "It is very good." Because God is good. All he creates is good. So now you look at the world. You go, okay, well, if God did all that, then why is everything all messed up? Brian, you say this God is all powerful and he's good, so why is the world a mess? Free will. I heard it. Because in order to love, when God created us to be in a relationship with him, we have to choose to love him. We're not robots. God created us and he said, "I want you to love me because I love you. And if you love me, you'll be in communion with me and you'll be able to share in my nature." That's what he wants for us. That's why we're here. But we have to make the choice. We have to choose to love him. So God puts the man and the woman in this beautiful garden that has everything they can need. And what does God say to them? He says, "You can eat of every tree in the garden. Every tree. Except for this one over here. This one over here is called the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. You can't eat from that one." Okay? I I'd be pretty happy with that. Probably get away with that. I can do anything I want, just not that one. Okay, cool. I'm good. So you would think Adam would be good, right? Let's understand something. When you hear that what we call command from God, how does that make you feel? Don't want to say it, just think about it. And I'll put it in a broader context. When you think about the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. What do you feel when you hear the 10 Commandments? I would venture to say that most of us learn the 10 Commandments by memorization. We were presented with these 10 critical rules that we had to follow in our lives, and we had to memorize them. And so a lot of us probably come away with this idea that God is some lawgiver who is just looking to get out punishment when people violate the law. That is a common perception of God because we don't understand the context in which God relates to us. So let's look at the garden. Everything the man could want, right? The man and the woman are there. Bliss, happiness. It's earthly paradise. God says, don't eat of that fruit. So they're thinking, well, let's look at it this way. They're thinking one of two things. They're thinking, what are you, pulling out on us? Or they're thinking, wow, you've given me everything? Yeah, I don't really need that. If you say don't do it because it's not good, I'm not going to do it. Those of you who are parents, when you're teaching your children things, isn't it true that we know things that they don't know? And we'll sometimes provide rules to them because we know it's in their best interest, even though they may not know it. Well, this is what God's doing. God tells Adam and Eve, he says, don't eat the fruit from that tree, because when you do, you're going to die. Why? What is the knowledge of good and evil? Well, think about the relationship. God, creator, universe, creator, and knower of all things. Man and woman, humans, puny, know nothing except what God has given them. It is not in the nature of humans, it is not in the nature of creatures to understand the origins of good and evil. It's not in our nature. We can't know unless we are told. So when God says, don't eat the fruit of that tree or you'll die, God knows, like when we tell a child, don't put your hand on the hot stove or you're going to get burned. God knows that when we try to do something that is not part of our nature, we die. Just like we know that if a child puts their hand on the stove, they're going to get burned. Now, think of the perspective. How many of you, when you first heard about the Garden of Eden story, thought, wow, why would God punish them because they ate that fruit? That's what a lot of us think. God punished Adam and Eve. What happened was, Adam and Eve did something that's not part of their nature and suffered the consequences of those actions. God happened to know what those consequences were going to be, so he warned them ahead of time. But the thing is that there's somebody else in the story. The somebody else in the story is the serpent. And believe me, the serpent isn't some cute little snake hanging from the branch of a tree. Revelation tells us that the serpent is a 10-headed or 12-headed dragon with, that's really nasty. And so what happens is the serpent, by the way, who is a creature, because the serpent is a fallen angel who God created. The serpent comes into the garden. Now, this is important to understand. The serpent, the evil one, the one we call the devil, because devil means divider, he's trying to divide us and separate us from God and from one another. That's all he's there for. That's what he's trying to accomplish, because he was not able to accept God's plan. And when he was presented with God's plan, he said, I will not serve. And so then he made it his mission to make sure that nobody else would serve God, would become united to God, because he separated himself from God. So his whole mission is to keep you away from God. That's his whole mission. And the reason I point that out is because we don't live in a world where we have two warring gods. It's not a war of good versus evil. There's no battle there. God is, and then there's everything else. So you notice the devil doesn't go after God, because he's smart, and he knows he can't win that fight. Who does he go after? You and me. Because he can win that fight. And Adam and Eve prove it. So he goes to visit Adam and Eve, and he goes to pay a little, he takes a little walk in the garden, and he says to Eve, he says, isn't it true that God said you can't eat from all the trees in the garden? And she's like, well, yeah, we can eat from all the trees, just not that one. And he says to her, you know why God doesn't want you to eat from that tree? Because if you do, you'll be like him. Now, what's the lie? Sounds reasonable, right? But what's he doing there? He's saying, number one, God doesn't want you to be happy. Number two, God's holding out on you. Number three, you can't trust this God because there's something he doesn't want for you. But in reality, what do we know? God created man and woman in his image and likeness. What's the lie? If you eat the fruit, you'll be like God. That's why he doesn't want you to. Wait a minute. We were created in his image and likeness. We're already like him. The other part of the lie is that the whole reason we exist is to become united to him and share in his divine nature. He wants us to be like him. He wants us to be part of him. But that's that lie. And so what he entices them to do is to act on their own and make their own determination of what is right and wrong. That's why it's called the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Because they now choose for themselves what they think to be right. That doesn't happen in today's world, does it? And what does it say in the scriptures? She took the fruit and ate it. Now, the next part of the story, I wish the projector was working, because the next part of the story is really intense in terms of what happens next. That's okay, it will take too long. But thank you. So God comes after this happens. So here's an interesting little tidbit. The man and the woman were created in the garden, they were naked and they were not ashamed. After they eat the fruit, what happens? They realize their nakedness and they are ashamed. What happened? There's a fundamental shift that happens after they eat the fruit. So they go and hide themselves. They hear God coming. So what used to happen was they would walk with God in the cool of the day. How nice. Now they hear God come, they run and hide. And God comes in and he says 3 words. And how do you read these 3 words and the next couple of lines are critical to your relationship with God. God comes in and says these 3 words. Where are you? Now, when you read those 3 words, what's the tone of voice that you're reading into those 3 words? Because here's the next thing God says. Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree I forbade you to eat? And then he says, why did you do that? What's the tone of voice you are hearing in your head? That's the all-important question. Because the tone of voice that you hear when you read that tells you one of 2 things. Either your perception of God is he's a lawgiver who gets angry when we break the law and therefore punishes us. Or are you hearing a loving Father whose heart is broken because his children have run away? Here's the way you're supposed to hear that when you read it. Where are you? And they respond. And Jesus says, what have you done? Do you realize what you have just done to yourself? Because what they've done is they have rebelled against God. They've chosen their own self instead of God. And by doing that, they cut themselves off from his life, which is why they died. Man was made to be immortal. The book of Wisdom tells us that. It's only because of the envy of the devil that death enters into the world. And so when God comes down, imagine if your child burned their hand on a stove. You're not mad at them. You're trying to help them. That's what God's doing. He's like, do you realize what you've just done? You have just unleashed hell on earth. God doesn't do it. We do it. And what Paul tells us is that they sold themselves into slavery that day when they made that choice. And they sold themselves into the slavery to the powers of sin and death. How do we know this? Because all of us die. We are under the power of death. And we're under the power of sin because we do the things we don't want to do, and we don't do the things that we do want to do. We are under the powers of sin and death. St. Paul tells us they are powers that rule over us. And as a result of that, the harm that humanity has now done in cutting itself off from the life of God is an infinite harm. And we as humans, being finite creatures, cannot fix it. So I'll tell you something else about God. Not only is God all-powerful and loving and good and love, he's also just. And in justice, if humanity is the one that broke the relationship, humanity has to fix the relationship. That's justice. Well, guess what? Humanity can't fix the relationship. Can't be done. So I'll let you think about that for a minute. And before I finish the story, Terry, do you want to come tell your story for a little bit? So think about that. And Terry's going to tell a little bit about his story and how he came to know Jesus.
Public speaking is not one of my favorite things in the world to do, but Father and I was praying together earlier this week, and I shared with him, and he said, would you be willing to speak at our Bible study tonight? And I said, I guess. So reluctantly. But most of you may not know this. I didn't grow up cradle Catholic. I grew up in a small town of about 3,000 people. We didn't even have a Catholic church where I grew up. And my mother raised 3 kids by herself. And one thing my mother made sure we did was go to church every Sunday. I mean, we did not miss church. So I grew up going to church every Sunday and got extremely involved in the Baptist church where I attended weekly. Later on in high school, very active in church youth groups and children's ministries and all of that. That was part of our church. Later on in my 20s, I moved to Memphis with some friends and took a job there. And one night, my girlfriend and I had gone out to dinner with some friends and was on our way home. And we were hit by a drunk driver. She and I both went through the door window of my car. Neither one were wearing seatbelts, and we're in our 20s and young and stupid. And but by the grace of God, I really believe we were thrown from the car because when I saw the pictures of the car, the engine was crushed all the way into the inside of the car. And I think God took us from that car so that we weren't crushed to death. So anyway, I laying in a hospital bed for a month, it really got me to thinking, because in my 20s, I never lost my faith, but I didn't attend church as often as I should. So it gave me time to reflect, and I got my butt back in church after that. So later on, of course, Jenny and I got married about 5 years later, and I was still very deep in my faith. So first year we got married, we attended both churches on Sunday. We were very holy. We started out at the Baptist church, and then we ended up at the Catholic church. But later on, as we began to start talking about family and so forth, I agreed that I would convert to Catholic faith, and so I went through RCI and everything and become Catholic. But it's, the more I learned about the Catholic faith and the Eucharist and being able to take part of that, it really just enriched my faith even more and more. And I got to believe God wants me here for some reason. I beat cancer twice. I was almost bled to death about a year and a half ago with a tear in my colon. Literally, the doctor looked at me after I got off the operating table, and he says, "You're lucky to be here, dude." And so I think by the grace of God, He wants me here for some crazy reason, and that's my story.
Thank you, Terry. That's some really good news. And it's a good bridge to, I'm going to tell you the rest of the story, which is the good news. You know how we can talk about the gospel being good news? But do we really understand why it's good news? So think about the despair, hopefully, you were just feeling after that first part of the talk. Right? You had greatness, awe, and the majesty of God. We threw it all away and enslaved ourselves to the power of sin and death, and now we have no hope. That's the reality. We have no hope. Because humans cannot create a relationship with God by themselves. Can't be done. Humans cannot share the divine life. You have no divinity in you without God. Can't be done. And if God is all justice, or if God has justice, then how do we bridge that gap? How do we restore that relationship? Well, the good news is God is also mercy. So justice is you get what you deserve. Mercy is you get what you don't deserve, or more than you deserve. So how does God balance justice and mercy? So the way he does it is God is actually a communion, like I said, a communion of persons, three persons. God looks at the plight of humanity and says, wait a minute, we created humanity so that they can be in relationship with us. We want men and women to be in relationship with us. We want men and women to share in this divine nature. We want you to share in our love. So God says the only way we're going to be able to fix this is to become human. Think about the God of all these stars in the universe and the planets and everything in creation says, I'm going to become a creature. So God takes on our nature, our human nature, so that he can enter into our situation. God becomes man. And by becoming man, you now have a God-man, because he doesn't lose his divinity. He's still divine, he's still God, but now he takes on and assumes human nature. And that's the person Jesus Christ, who is the Son of God. So it is a historical fact, and we'll talk about this another time, but it is a historical fact that a man named Jesus lived 2,000 something years ago in Palestine. And this man Jesus made some pretty outrageous claims about himself. And to short circuit it, he claimed to be God. Now, as C.S. Lewis tells us, there's only one of three things you can make of that. Well, nowadays we can add a fourth, but the fourth is easily disproven. Either he's a myth, right, a legend. We know that's not true, and I don't have time to prove that for you tonight, but it's simple. It's really easy. So Jesus existed, and so anyone who would claim to be God is one of three things. He either is God, or he knows he's not God, but he's claiming to be, and therefore is a liar. Or he's not God, but thinks he is, and therefore he's crazy. There is no other option. He's not a good teacher if he's not God. He's not just a good philosopher or a good moral, somebody with good morals to follow. Nope. Because if he's not God, yet claimed to be, then none of those other things can be true. That's just a fact. So, is he a liar? Is he a lunatic? Or is he actually God? And how do we know? Well, when Jesus came to this world, he took on our humanity. The reason he came was to release us, free us from the powers of sin and death. That is the reason that he came. So that through him, we can be reunited to God. Because that's why we're here. Is to be united to God and have a relationship with him. So Jesus comes to the earth, he takes on our humanity, and he enters fully into it. And in his humanity, he keeps his divinity hidden. Why? Because he needs to die. Jesus came to die. That's why he came. Why? Let's look at it. Let's figure it out. It's not real hard. When Jesus comes, he says, I have come to lay down my life. I lay down my life. Nobody takes my life from me. And to prove that, there's 3 situations that happen in the scriptures which are really quite funny. One of them, he says to the people, he's talking in the synagogue, and he says, before he's talking about Abraham and how Abraham longed to see this day, and the people are like, you're not even 50 years old, and Abraham's like died many, many centuries ago. And he says, before Abraham was, I am. He's basically saying, I'm God. And they go to stone him. And he just gets away through their midst, just walks through their midst and leaves. That doesn't happen. There's another time, a few chapters later, where they try to arrest him. And he leaves and walks away. And then the best one, after the Last Supper, he's in the garden, and they're coming to arrest him. And all the guys come, they got their spears and their clubs and their chains and ropes and everything, and they're ready to take him. And they say, and he goes, who are you looking for? And they said, Jesus. And he goes, that's me. And they all got knocked down just by him saying, I am he. So if Jesus didn't want to be killed, he wasn't going to be killed. So Jesus allows himself to be arrested. He allows himself to be tortured beyond any human kind of ability to withstand the kind of torture that he went through. As he further and further enters into his disguise of humanity. Because the devil is trying to get him. Because the devil doesn't recognize who he is fully. He's not quite sure. So he's entering further and further into this disguise of humanity as he gets tortured, beaten to half to death, nailed to a cross, suffocated. But he's all doing it of his own will. He's allowing it all to happen to him as he predicted and as he has said. And so, as he enters into that, I think Father John Ricardo has a great image. He says he was in prayer one time and God gave him this image as he was thinking about talking about this. He said the image that came to him, 2 words came to his mind, and it was ambush predator. So he Googled ambush predator. And there are actually animals out there who, what they do is they disguise themselves into their surroundings and they just wait until their prey comes by because they can't see them, and then they attack. And he likens this to what Jesus was doing. Jesus is the ambush predator. As he's on the cross, dying, entering into death, and the devil thinks he's won. This guy who everybody's following, who claims to be God, just like every other human, he's now dead. I win. I got him. But the reason Jesus had to die is because, remember back in the garden, when man rebelled against God and said, God, I don't want your life, I want the life that I choose, we then chose death, and we can't escape death. But Jesus, because he's God and human, he enters into death so that he can destroy it. Jesus enters into death, and then he rises from the dead. He comes back to life. Not just a normal life, like, oh, he resuscitated and he died 20 years later. No. He rose from the dead and he's never died. He defeated death. How do we know this? Because there were witnesses. So how does somebody prove that they're God? That's how Jesus did it. He proved he was God because he rose from the dead. Without the resurrection, Jesus is just another man that got, murdered by the Romans. But by rising from the dead, he proves that he's more than that. He's God. So why do we believe the story? Why should you believe that Jesus died and rose from the dead? The same reason you believe everything else. 85% of everything you know, you didn't learn on your own or experience. You were told by somebody else. Roughly 85% of all of your knowledge comes from being told by somebody else what is true. And you choose to believe it because of the credibility of the person who told you. So let's talk about the people who witnessed the resurrection of Jesus. The most important of them were 11 guys who were, because they saw Jesus rose from the dead, they went and shared it with other people. And because of that, they were all tortured, murdered, and killed. Except for one of them. That's why I said except for one of them. But here's the thing. Nobody in the history of the world has ever died for what they know to be a lie. So if Jesus died and did not rise again, and the apostles knew that, they would not have gone through that. It's not a conspiracy. Why else would we believe that? Well, they were tortured to death, told to recant, right? And they didn't recant, being tortured. Like some of them skinned alive. Some of them hung on crosses. And they never, not one of them, said, okay, we're just making it up. They weren't tricked. Somebody stole the body and they saw the empty tomb and said, oh, Jesus must have risen. No, Jesus came and appeared to them. And they witnessed to that. The most credible eyewitnesses you will ever encounter. And that's why we believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And because he rose from the dead to prove that he is God, he destroys death for us. So that chasm that exists when we said no to God and we rejected his life, Jesus restores that for us. So now, as a man, because he's both human and divine, he's God who takes on humanity, he can solve the justice and the mercy. The mercy is that God becomes man. The justice is now man, who is God, has restored the relationship between humanity and God. That's the good news. That's why we love Jesus. Because of what he did to restore that relationship. And so now we look at that and say, okay, wow, that worldview is quite a bit different than, oh, we're just here by chance. That worldview puts some meaning to our life. Because now we have something that we are striving toward, which is that relationship with God that Jesus set up for us and gave us the opportunity to achieve. And so everything that we do is to be geared toward that relationship with God. That's why we exist. That's why we were made. And so until we get to the point that we have that union with God, we will always have a longing and a gap in our hearts. And we try to fill that with so many things that just don't work. because we have a gap in our hearts, a longing and a desire for an infinite relationship with God. And that relationship can never be satisfied by something finite. So as much as we try to seek happiness with the pleasures and the things of this world, you will never achieve happiness that way. You will only achieve happiness by having a relationship with God and Him being your focus. That's why the first commandment of God, which we'll talk about in another talk about the context of the commandments, but the first commandment is you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Because that is the only way you're ever going to truly be happy. The only way. So that's the good news. Is that now it's possible. Now we don't have to be bound to death. Because Jesus promises us is that even though you're going to die, you will rise again. Because He's destroyed the power of death. So even though we still die, we will rise again. We will have life eternal. And we have the ability to overcome sin. And we'll talk about that in the future talk too. We have the ability now to overcome sin. We're no longer slaves to sin. You don't have to sin. Because Jesus has given you the power to not sin. So one final thought before we leave. So you might ask yourself, well, if Jesus did all that and He destroyed sin and death, then why are we still in this state? So I'll give you an analogy to think about. In World War II, the Germans had pretty much taken over all of Europe until the U.S. came and the U.S. invaded Normandy and pushed the Germans back. At that point, the war was over. It was only a matter of time before Germany was beaten. But there was still a lot of time that had to pass and a lot of battles that had to be fought before finally Hitler was dealt with. And before finally Germany was pushed back to where the war could be over and we could have a lasting peace. That's kind of the situation we're in now. Jesus' death and resurrection is like D-Day. The battle's won, or the war's won, but we still have to fight a bunch of battles before we finally get to the end. But we have to be there. We have to be faithful, and we have to have that relationship with Jesus because we can't do it ourselves. That's the lesson. We can't do it ourselves because we cut ourselves off from that life of God. Now we can only get it back through Jesus Christ. So that's the good news. And what we'll talk about next time is what Jesus did to help us have that relationship with Him and be able to enter into the communion and relationship with God like we were supposed to. So thank you all for coming.
Great job. Great job. Great job. I was just telling I just came back from changed my job. I'm glad I